Attack on Titan is considered by many as one of the best series of all time. With charismatic characters, a brilliantly written story and an incredible soundtrack, it stands out from the rest through the themes it addresses, and the way it addresses them. One of the key themes in Hajime Isayama's works is vengeance. The plot of Attack on Titan is based on a cycle, the cycle of violence. The story begins with the attack on the Shiganshina district and War Maria by the warrior unit sent by Marley. This attack and the Titan invasion it caused trigger a quest and a desire for vengeance inside the protagonist, Eren Yeager. He vows to take revenge and to exterminate every last Titan. During his quest, he discovers that he himself possesses the power to turn into a Titan, just as his enemies do, and he uses this newfound power to help humanity fight back against the invaders. Eren's quest for violence gradually makes him lose his own humanity, to the point where he attacks Liberio, the hometown of the Malian warriors, crushing Mali's military and causing many collateral victims among the civilians, even including children, despite the fact that most of them were part of his own people. Eren inflicts upon his enemies what he himself experienced and suffered, and thus loses more and more of his humanity, so much so that his original enemies end up being less monstrous than Eren himself, a change so significant it even shows through his appearance. And just like the attack on Shiganshina by the warriors, the raid on Liberio by Eren will in turn push other characters towards a quest for vengeance. Once you engage on the path of violence, you only end up causing more violence. This idea of a cycle of violence may go overlooked at first when beginning the series. At that point, the enemies were only composed of titans without intelligence or humanity, who attacked and devoured the inhabitants of Paradis without distinction. Fighting against them was therefore simply a necessity for humanity's survival. And although some inside the walls weren't motivated by mere survival but by a desire for vengeance, all were moving in the same direction, towards the same goal, and even though they did it with different methods and reasons, at the end of the day, all desired the end of the Titans. Consequently, their motives were almost irrelevant. So, when the enemies we thought were mere monsters turned up to be not only humans, but people we cared about, this diversity of motivations and morality suddenly took on a predominant place in the story. From this point on, the individual desires and points of view of the characters begin clashing with one another and defining the actions they will perform and the sides they will take. In other words, from then on, the characters' interactions with the cycle of violence bring the story forward. Despite all the horror it causes, not everyone desires the end of the cycle of violence. Some revel in the cruelty it allows, others find in it a meaning and a direction to their life. Originally a minor character, Floch Forster, who would eventually become the leader of the Yeagerists, made himself known when, as the sole survivor of the massacre of the Survey Corps at the hands of the Beast Titan, he vigorously advocated for the revival of Commander Erwin Smith, even though Erwin was behind the plan that ultimately caused the massacre. His motive? Humanity needs a demon ready to sacrifice everything, including his own morality, to ensure the destruction of his enemies and thus achieve victory. In other words, Floch wants to follow someone who would push the cycle of violence ever further. He gives in to his desires for vengeance, always considering them to be justified despite their immorality. This craving for violence is illustrated when he has no qualms about destroying the civilian houses during the raid at Liberio, even though those civilians were Eldians like him, considering them to be enemies first and foremost. Similarly, he wanted to throw Falco and Gabi out of the airship after the latter shot Sasha, without taking into account the fact that they were both children and that killing them would change nothing. Though Floch is a special case due to his awareness of the immorality of his actions, he nonetheless represents the opinions of most of the inhabitants of Paradis, and that of the oppressors in the rest of the world. Floch embodies the perspective of the Yeagerists, but more than that, the perspective of those who, whether they realize it or not, perpetuate the cycle of violence. This makes him an antagonist during the Rambling arc, for from his point of view, by exterminating the rest of humanity, Eren becomes the ultimate demon, and therefore the only person worthy of being followed. Violence is not indissociable from the cycle, and using violence doesn't necessarily mean submitting to the vicious circle of vengeance and suffering. Armin Arlert is driven by a simple dream, to see the wonders of the outside world. The only thing keeping him from reaching that dream is the cruelty and violence of the world. He is therefore naturally opposed to this violence. However, like Floch, he understands that without sacrificing anything, you cannot achieve anything, and that in order to defeat monsters, you must be willing to relinquish your humanity, becoming a monster yourself. But his understanding of this doesn't mean those are concepts he approves of. They are principles he is forced to obey due to the cruel nature of this world. The difference between Armin and someone like Floch is that Armin is fundamentally opposed to violence, and that he will always look for another solution. For if we win against monsters while sacrificing our humanity, was it really worth it? Or was it even a victory to begin with? Armin will always look for alternatives to violence, and even if there are none, he will keep trying until confrontation becomes unavoidable. But when it is too late, and the deed has already been done, it is human nature to try to justify it to oneself. So, when Armin thought the Survey Corps had eliminated Reiner during the Battle of Shiganshina, he tried to convince himself that there were no other solutions, that Reiner didn't leave them any chance to negotiate or talk this through, and that they lacked information about titans and warriors for an alternative to be available anyway. But attempting to convince oneself implies that one doesn't really believe in it. And so, when Bertolt descended to the battle, Armin didn't miss his chance. He tried to understand his reasons and objectives to talk him out of the fight. When Bertolt refused to negotiate, Armin tried intimidation and blackmailed him using his beloved Annie's alleged torture. And only when this solution also failed and Bertolt started attacking him, did Armin resign himself to engage the fight and to make any sacrifice necessary to ensure victory, including giving up his own life. In the case of the raid at Liberio, the hands of both Armin and the Survey Corps were forced by Eren, who informed them of his decision to attack Marley only when it was too late to discuss or to find other options. For if Eren had died or been captured, Marley would have seized the Founding Titan, and that would mean the end for Paradis. Thus, it is reluctantly that Armin destroyed Liberio's port, annihilating the Marleyan fleet and reinforcements, and sacrificing numerous innocent civilians in the process. But Armin's violence is not that of the cycle. As I said, violence is not indissociable from the cycle, if it is not born from hatred and the desire for vengeance. Though the cycle of violence is indeed the reason for most large-scale conflicts in the story, it is not impossible to oppose it while using violence when no other means are accessible. But such a usage of violence still has consequences, both for the victims of course, who could very well enter in turn the cycle of violence, and for the perpetrators, Armin in that case. Indeed, how can he pretend to want to end violence when he himself perpetrates such horrible acts? Guilt from the destruction of Liberio's port weighed heavily upon Armin, which, when combined with his belief that he wasn't the right person to bring back to life during the Battle of Shiganshina, only fed into his doubts and self-loathing. It's therefore no surprise that Armin was the first to oppose the Rumbling and Eren's global genocide. Considering violence as the only way to obtain peace goes against everything he believes in and everything he fights for. Though differing by some aspects, Armin's perspective is that of the protagonists and of the members of the Alliance to stop Eren and his massacre of humanity beyond the walls. This point of view isn't as naive as one may think at first, because Armin and the others know that violence as a last resort may be inevitable. But they have a conscience, their deeds weigh on them and they regret them, and that is why those deeds do not turn them into monsters. Attack on Titan's story also possesses cycles other than that of violence. The series insists heavily on the need to not repeat the errors of the past, for they will only lead to the same mistakes again and again, an idea strongly linked to the cycle of violence. This theme is particularly explored by the character of Grisha Yeager. Rightfully opposing his father's attempted pro-Marleyan indoctrination, he joins the Restorationists, an extremist group aiming to restore the Eldian Empire and to end Marley's reign. In following his desire for vengeance, seeking to make them suffer just like they made him suffer, he embarks on the cycle of hatred, which causes and is caused by the cycle of violence. Without realizing it, Grisha repeats the errors of the past, and ends up trying to indoctrinate his son Zeke with contrary ideas to his own father's attempted brainwashing. This would lead Zeke to in turn oppose his father's ideas. After being deported to Paradis, Grisha realizes the mistakes that he made, and that he was merely a cog in an endless cycle of indoctrination, of extremism, and of violence. His character evolves. Instead of relishing the sight of Gross, the man who had fed his little sister to his hounds, being devoured by a titan, he finds it unbearably horrible. So, When Eren Kruger tasks him with stripping the King of the Walls of the Founding Titan to finally crush Marley, he accepts, yet hatred has ceased to be his principal motivation, replaced by his guilt, the guilt of unknowingly participating in a cycle that would only bring ruin. And thus, when the time has come to see his mission through, to devour the Founding Titan and to massacre the royal family, he refuses. His guilt keeps him from committing new atrocities, from repeating the same mistakes, and from bringing forth yet more violence. Grisha rids himself of his past hatred and refuses to continue the cycle of violence. He has become free. But, as we know, this is not how the story goes. This is where Eren intervenes, appearing from the future to recall his past. He reminds him of his suffering, of the mistakes he made. He pulls him back inside the cycle of violence, reminding him of the place he occupied within it, both as a victim and as a perpetrator. And so, forcefully brought back into hatred and violence and robbed of his freedom, Grisha massacres the Reis family. Grisha Yeager is a man who managed to free himself from the cycle of hatred, but whose past mistakes caught up to and pulled back into the cycle. He represents those who had both the strength and willpower to free themselves from the cycle of violence, only to be brought back against their will by a suffering calling through the emotions they felt while inside the cycle. Leaving the cycle is therefore no permanent feat. Conflict is present in human nature, and it will always manifest itself one way or another. Attack on Titan proves this with a character who, although he did not appear directly in the series, had a colossal impact on the plot. This character is Karl Fritz, the first King of the Walls. A century before the events of the story, and after witnessing and regretting the horrors his people inflicted on the Marlians, King Karl Fritz took the decision to put a permanent end to Eldia's crimes. To do so, he locked most of his people up inside of Paradise Island and erased all their memories of the outside world, so that they couldn't harm anyone anymore. To allow them to live out their days in peace while waiting for their eventual destruction at the hands of Marley, Karl Fritz erected the walls of Paradis and created the millions upon millions of colossal titans trapped within, who would serve as a deterrent force for the time being. As for his own power, the power of the Founding Titan, he restrained it and engraved in it his pacifist ideology. From then on, when Karl Fritz's descendants would seek to use the power of the Founder, or to go against his vow-renouncing war, his ideology would override their personalities and desires, to the point where they essentially became an extension of his own will, effectively compelled to inaction for the generations to come. And so, for the century that followed, a now unchallenged Marley could impose its domination on the continent and the entire world, and seize control of most of the 9 Titans. The remainder of the Eldians outside of Paradis, deprived of the protection provided by their Titans and by the King, were then oppressed by the rest of the world. For Karl Fritz, Eldia's crimes were so considerable that no redemption was possible, and that the Eldians didn't even deserve to fight against their own extinction. In other words, he directly and forcefully removed his people from the cycle of violence, robbing them and their descendants of any chance at a counterattack, and thus of their free will. Karl Fritz's goal and hope was that the cycle would eventually end by itself, once the Malian Empire had exterminated the Eldians. However, as the show proves, Fritz's ideology was flawed. Even though his people was deprived of ways to fight back, it retained the desire to do so. This is precisely the reason behind the creation of the Restorationists, who would eventually overcome the royal family. By seeking to stop the cycle of violence through inaction, Karl Fritz only succeeded in creating another cycle, a cycle of adoration and ignorance. His descendants, the Reis family, and most notably Rod Reis, as well as Paradise Island's highest nobility and officials, worshipped in an almost fanatical way the power of the Founder and the servitude they were submitted to. This deification is also found within the Church of the Walls, which further illustrates the religious aspect of it. This adoration of one's servitude is also another core theme of the series. Karl Fritz's ideology would therefore never have put an end to the cycle of violence. Inaction is a choice by itself, and hoping that Eldia would be destroyed by Marley so that it could never inflict suffering on the rest of the world only caused in turn more pain and destruction. There is no character in the series more opposed to Karl Fritz's ideology than the show's main protagonist and antagonist, Eren Yeager. I took him as an example to explain the cycle of violence in the first place, because he is the most explicit expression of this theme in the story. But Eren does have a peculiar status regarding the cycle. Eren saw his life and his hometown ravaged by the warriors' attack, and he developed a boundless hatred for the Titans, who robbed him of everything he had. And to fight those Titans, he was ready to do anything, including becoming a monster himself. By discovering that the Titans and then the warriors were actually mere victims, just like he was, he realized the situation was not that simple. However, to him, it wasn't that complex either. The Titans were Eldians forcefully transformed, and the warriors were brainwashed children, yes, but to him, the Marlians were the culprits, absolute evil, responsible for all the horrors he had experienced. His hatred for his enemies never vanished. It simply changed target as the enemy's identity was becoming clearer and clearer, or more and more blurred. Who is the true enemy? When the question was asked, the answer appeared so simple, both for Eren and for the audience. The enemies are Titans, it's obvious. But no, the Titans and the warriors were simply victims. But even then, as previously stated, the answer still stayed clear in Eren's mind. Driven by his boundless hatred for Marley and the outside world, he had already decided, before he even left Paradis, to enact the rumbling and to wipe out the entire world. However, as we've seen, from the start, his enemies never really were that different from him, and the more he moved forward in his quest, the more similar to him they became. And as he discovered after traveling to the other side of the sea, even the Marlians were only humans like any other. At this precise moment, just like his father before him, Eren realized that making hatred his driving force would only lead to more senseless violence. He became aware of the cycle of violence, of the suffering it causes to everyone, and of the necessity to bring it to an end. But despite those discoveries, Eren isn't Karl Fritz choosing an action. He isn't Armin choosing dialogue. And most importantly, he isn't his father, Grisha, choosing not to go further into his hatred and violence, refusing to be a part of the cycle. His hatred may be gone, but he cannot stop, he doesn't want to stop. Whether he's motivated by vengeance, by a desire to achieve a twisted idea of freedom, or for another reason entirely, an urge of unknown origin both to Eren and the audience, it doesn't change anything. Eren only knows one thing, one solution. Whatever occurs, whatever happens, one unique solution, one unique action. Keep moving forward until his enemies are destroyed. To break the cycle, he will push it ever further, to its utmost limit. If he slaughters all of his enemies, he will put an end to the slaughter. Truth is, he simply cannot live without violence. A world without violence would be unbearable to him, boring in the extreme. If you win, you live. If you lose, you die. Without a fight, you cannot win. Fight. Fight. For him, violence is more than a solution or the answer to a problem. It is the obvious, indisputable only way to live. It is a part of him, of his nature, present inside of him even before the warrior's attack and his initiation into the cycle of violence. But beyond this need to use violence as a sole recourse, Eren has another goal, much simpler, much more grounded, and much more humane. The wish for his close ones, his friends and those he loves, to live long and happy lives. For all these reasons, Eren cannot see another answer than the rumbling. Not only does it allow him to ensure his loved ones are able to live out their lives safely, it also allows him to unleash all the repressed violence inside of him. But even then, he carries it out almost reluctantly. He understands that the atrocity of a massacre of this scale would make him the worst of monsters, and that he would exterminate even the innocents undeserving of such a fate. Still, he is forced by his nature and his way of thinking to execute his plan. And to justify the rumbling, while the Titans have already started their march of doom, he makes use of the cycle. After all, it's not his fault. His enemies initiated this chain of events themselves by destroying his life. They're responsible for this. They have only themselves to blame, right? To protect himself from his guilt, he falls back into the thought pattern induced by the cycle of violence he had previously abandoned. He tries to go back to being an ignorant pawn of the cycle, to forget what he witnessed and learned about the cycle and his enemies. But he is unable to do so. He keeps moving forward, but without any conviction, which is reflected by his founding Titan form. Although of an unmatched scale and size, it doesn't possess the vitality and vigorous strength characteristic of the attacked Titan, becoming instead a twisted, empty shell, a deformed skeletal monstrosity. Eren's intense hatred of Karl Fritz's ideology comes from the fact that he is its exact antithesis. Whereas Karl Fritz acted through inaction and wanted his people to pay for their crimes and to be finally eliminated, Eren puts his people first and continues to move forward, exterminating the rest of the world for their sake so that they can live in peace. His hatred for Zeke's euthanasia plan can be explained in the same way, since it shares many similarities with the first King of the Wall's own plan. Eren is no slave to the cycle. He managed to escape the cycle of violence, but pushes it ever forward in order to destroy it. In a way, he is the culmination of the cycle's violence, becoming, so to speak, the embodiment of the cycle itself, a demon combining suffering and hatred, and leaving only more hatred and destruction in its trail. This is why the Alliance's fight against Eren in his rumbling is not driven by hatred or by a desire for vengeance. They are fighting the cycle itself. They are fighting the fate of countless innocents, that of being massacred without purpose or exception. What they are fighting is the merciless enemy of all life. Violence will only lead to more violence. Hatred will only lead to more hatred. Eren's actions had consequences, and if he caused countless deaths, he also changed the living. Gabi Braun is Eren's exact reflection. Just like him, she had her life ravaged by the attack of her hometown Liberio, and developed a deep hatred for the demons of Paradise Island and for Eren himself, the ones she considers responsible for all of her and her close ones' suffering. However, unlike Eren, when this tragedy strikes, she's already prepared to face it. Whereas Eren was only a child during the attack on Shiganshina, Gabi is a trained soldier and a gifted warrior candidate during the raid on Liberio. And so, she's not helpless against the invaders, and already has ways to fight them. She takes down Lobov, a member of the Survey Corps, and uses his gear to board their airship as they were retreating. Then, she aims, shoots, and kills Sasha. This murder is a turning point in her connection to the cycle of hatred, but not in the way we may first assume. It doesn't push her further into hatred and violence, quite the opposite actually. Brought to Paradise Island, Gabi is an involuntary witness to the consequences of her actions. Sheltered by the family of the woman she killed, unaware of her deed, she at first doesn't believe that their intentions and actions are benevolent and selfless. But as time passes, she is forced to recognize that they mean her no harm, even knowing her identity as an alien from Mali. Through Kaya and her story about the attack of her village, she begins to question Mali's actions and her previous beliefs that the people of Paradise must pay for the crimes of their ancestors. Gabi is forced to see the inhabitants of Paradise not as evil demons, but as human beings, just like Eren did during his stay at Mali. Every trace of doubt is all but erased from her mind after the clash of her previous way of thinking with reality during her confrontation with Niccolo, a Malian who had feelings towards Sasha. She realizes herself that her actions had consequences, and how absurd her reasons for them were. And so, because of her experiences, she learns to sympathize with and to trust the people of Paradise, and thus cannot justify her arbitrary hatred for them anymore. Her hatred and desire for vengeance disappear as she becomes aware of the cycle's existence, and that she participated in it without realizing it, again and again repeating the mistakes of the past. Sasha's murder had a major positive impact on Gabi. For if she hadn't climbed inside the airship, she would have stayed in Liberio, consumed by hatred and slowly losing her humanity. Instead, Gabi freed herself from the cycle of hatred, and showed that even when we are convinced of the justification of our own actions, it is still possible to realize the humanity of those we hate, and that considering them as monsters or demons is both unfounded and false. She incarnates hope for future generations to rid themselves of the hatred of their legacy, and to live free of violence and its destructive cycle. The cycle's grasp is thus not permanent. It is possible for the new generations to free themselves from it. But then, what about those directly concerned? The people already fighting? Reiner Braun once was, just like Eren and Gabi, a mere pawn of the cycle. Born to an Eldian mother and a Malian father, he voluntarily enlisted in the warrior unit, so that he and his mother could become honorary Malians and have a better life. In addition to the guilt for Eldir's past crimes, passed down to him by his mother, he undergoes Mali's indoctrination and becomes a devoted child soldier, with an ardent desire to rid the world of the devils of Paradise Island, clearly responsible for all the world's suffering. At an early age, he is placed inside the cycle of hatred. But all his convictions and principles end up crumbling after his departure for Paradis. Not only did his father never want to find him or live with him and his mother, but he himself wasn't even supposed to receive the honor of inheriting the armored titan in the first place. After destroying Wall Maria and causing the titan invasion inside the world, he is forced to live in the chaos he himself initiated, infiltrating Paradis Island's population in order to locate and retrieve the founding titan. It's at this moment he realizes, like Eren and Gabi after him, that his enemies, the inhabitants of Paradis, weren't actually monsters, but ordinary humans ignorant of the outside world. Devoured by his guilt, his mind snaps and splits into two, the merciless Malian warrior and the devoted Survey Corps soldier. And when he could act as his heart desires, to join Paradis to help them fight against the Malian Empire, his shattered mind lacks the necessary strength to do so. Not knowing what is right anymore, he follows through on the mission he sacrificed so much for, and decides to fulfill his duty to the bitter end. But after the failure of the aforementioned mission and his return to Mali, his guilt and his traumas keep eating away at him. He falls deeper and deeper into depression, he loses a lot of weight, as well as his drive to do anything, and he even almost commits suicide when the prospect of returning to Paradis becomes more and more realistic. However, he eventually manages to find a goal, something worth living and fighting for. To protect Gabi and Falco, the children he cares about, from living the same hell he did, he finds the mental strength he previously lacked. And although his past traumas almost literally come to haunt him again when Eren arrives at Liberio, taking him out of the fight for just about the entirety of the raid, it is indeed in those children he finds the strength to once again face Eren. But for the first time, he fights for something he truly believes in, and his Titan form doesn't exhibit its characteristic armor. To face the monster Eren has become, Reiner regains his humanity. He suffered a living hell due to his guilt, and through Gabi and Falco he found redemption, freeing himself from the cycle of violence he'd been participating in without any conviction. He escaped from the cycle that caused him so much pain, not by fighting to take revenge against his enemies, but to save those he loves. During the second battle of Shiganshina, he therefore has the mental upper hand against Eren. He doesn't fight for a cause he doesn't believe in anymore, but for a true goal. This is also the first fight against Eren he ends up winning. If Gabi is the hope for future generations to live free of the cycle of violence, Reiner embodies hope for those already fighting, those directly inside the cycle. The path may not be easy to cross, it may even seem impossible, or look like it causes even more pain than the cycle itself, but it is still possible to repent and to cease to play into the hands of a vicious circle of hatred, violence, and conflict. But what would happen if we were to mix Karl Fritz's ideals with Eren Yeager's determination? What would be the result of a combination of the desire to shield one's people from the cycle of violence, consequently protecting them and the rest of the world from further suffering, with a willingness to make all the sacrifices deemed necessary to achieve one's goal without ever stopping or backing down? If such a person were to exist, they would be an unrelenting force, ready to fight through anyone and anything to achieve their goal. This force, this person, is Zeke Yeager. Son of Grisha Yeager and Dinah Fritz and descendant of royal blood, Zeke was raised with both the extremist restorationist ideas and doctrines of his parents and Mali's contrary ones taught by his grandparents. However, his father and mother were more preoccupied with their mission to destroy the Malian Empire than by their own son, and thought about him more as an asset for their cause due to his royal blood than as their child. Zeke was therefore forcefully enrolled into the warrior program, in which he didn't really shine with excellence, probably due to his lack of personal motivation. Nonetheless, it is there that he would meet Tom Xaver, who was the Beast Titan at the time, and whom he would befriend. Xaver notably helped him discover his gift for playing catch, a game that would become one of his greatest passions, largely preferring it to the war-related activities that his parents and his training destined him to. When he found out that the restorationists were about to be identified and arrested by Mali, Zeke begged his parents to stop before they were all made into titans and sent to Paradis. After they refused, Zeke went to Xaver for advice, and Xaver gave him his only solution: to denounce them. Although it broke his heart, Zeke complied, assuring both his and his grandparents' safety and securing his place within the warriors as the inheritor of Xaver's Beast Titan. Unlike Grisha, Xaver's personality was very calm and his ideas pacifist, and he would think about Zeke as his own son. And so, Zeke was brought up knowing both sides of the cycle of hatred, but not actually being a part of it himself. This singular point of view on the cycle offered him the necessary perspective to develop unique ideas to bring it to an end. After a conversation with 𝗧𝗏, during which the latter had taught him about the Founding Titan's ability to alter the anatomy of all subjects of Ymir, Zeke formulated the idea that the Founding Titan could strip the Eldians of their ability to reproduce, which would lead to their extinction after about 100 years, and thus to the elimination of Titans. If such a thing were to occur, the world wouldn't have to fear their potential for destruction, and the children the Eldians would have brought into this world wouldn't have to suffer its cruelty and violence. After all, for him, if we hadn't been born to begin with, we wouldn't have to suffer this much. This idea became his drive and goal. To obtain the Founding Titan's power and fulfill his mission, he would be ready to do anything, to commit any atrocity, and to make all the sacrifices necessary. For in this cruel world, without sacrifice, you cannot change anything. So, whereas Eren wishes to stop the cycle of violence by pushing it always further, exterminating his enemies to the last, Zeke wants to do the opposite, to remove his own people from the cycle, but unlike Karl Fritz, in an active way. With his euthanasia plan, he fights to be able to leave the fight. Contradictorily, by fighting to end it, he only perpetuates the cycle of violence. His brutal and insensitive use of violence eventually lead to the rise of the cycle's servant, the merciless man Floch would become. Zeke wishes for his people to face a peaceful end, whatever the cost. To save future generations, he is ready to sacrifice even children, as shown when he turned Falco into a Titan. To protect his people from the world's violence, he is ready to slaughter them and the rest as much as necessary. If Eren represents the cycle, Floch those who follow it, Armin those who oppose it, Gabi and Reiner those who manage to escape it, and Grisha those who don't, Zeke is despair. He is the despair brought forth by the cycle, the conviction that nothing will be able to end it, that it will forever be a part of the world, and that not being born in the first place would be preferable to a life of suffering under its rule. Zeke is unable to perceive the beauty in this world, only focusing on its cruelty, and his willpower and lack of mercy convey the despair he embodies to those he faces. Right from his first appearance, he petrifies Mike, one of the best soldiers of Paradis, with unrelenting fear, and proves the wrongness of his motto, "Only when we stop fighting do we truly lose," by killing him precisely because he kept the will to fight. Even Erwin Smith, the bravest of the bravest, was shaken by his ruthless tactics during the Battle of Shiganshina, and the prospect of his survival momentarily made Levi Ackerman, humanity's strongest soldier, lose faith. Zeke's goal and its implications are in opposition with the immense majority of the show's characters, making him, if only thematically, the story's main antagonist. He is ready to do anything to free the Eldians from the suffering caused by the cycle, without even once considering not using violence himself. And this is his contradiction. By fighting to put an end to the cycle, he perpetuates it, almost justifies it. Zeke is Eren's direct antithesis, and their confrontation is that of two diametrically opposed ideals. The cycle of violence's destructive nature isn't to be proven. It brings devastation, corruption, and hate. But that's not all. Above all, what it brings is suffering. And who best to embody this suffering of the innocents, of those who do not take part in the cycle and are only collateral victims, than the founder, Ymir Fritz herself. Suffering is what can best characterize her existence. Forced to slavery and mentally broken since childhood, she was gifted with a power beyond all comprehension, able to bring both prosperity and ruin. But even though the appearance of Ymir's Founding Titan was a major turn in the war opposing Marley and Eldia, she herself wasn't part of the cycle of hatred, at least not directly, and for a simple reason. She doesn't feel hatred, nor any desire for vengeance. She only knows submission, and it is because of her submission that she served King Fritz, obeying any and all of his commands even though she possessed the strongest power in existence. Even after her death, her suffering didn't end, and she was transported to the realm of the past, a world beyond time and death, where she was trapped by her submission to the king. Ymir Fritz was forced to conceive and build every single Titan when they were summoned to Earth, for eternity. Since the Titan's transformation mostly occurred in the context of violence to bring on even more violence, her forced labor causes and is caused by the cycle. Ymir Fritz is quite literally a prisoner of the cycle, unable to escape her endless prison of suffering. She represents those who, no matter the side or the time they found themselves in, were the innocents, the collateral victims of the cycle of violence. Such is Ymir's status during her torment. But at the arrival of Eren and Zeke in the paths, something peculiar happened inside of her. Ymir Fritz is thrown into the opposition of the antinomian point of view of the Yeager brothers. Their goal, whether it be direct or not, is to free her. Using the authority his royal blood has on her, Zeke orders her to enact his euthanasia plan, so that when the last subjects of Ymir would perish, the Titans and their powers would disappear, supposedly along with the paths and Ymir Fritz's world of suffering. In other words, Zeke wants her to continue her servitude a little longer, in order to ultimately free her. This justification of one's actions for the greater good is also present in Zeke via his usage of violence to end the cycle. What Eren proposes to Ymir is likewise also noteworthy. He doesn't offer her freedom or salvation, not at all. Instead, he gives her the possibility to escape her position as a victim, but only to replace it with the role of perpetrator. He uses her suffering to awaken a desire for vengeance inside her, making her in turn enter the cycle of violence. The consequence of Ymir's decision to follow Eren is, of course, the rumbling. We've seen various characters' links with the cycle of violence, and the rumbling and the nigh omnicide it proposes makes all of these points of view stand out and interact with one another. The rumbling's thematical meaning, when we consider its causes and consequences, is also quite interesting. The rumbling is the trampling of the world by millions of colossal titans, originally created by Karl Fritz to serve only as a deterrent force to protect his people. It was then activated with Ymir's help by Eren, who could only access the Founder's power through Zeke and his royal blood. To put it differently, using what we've previously said and extrapolating a bit, the rumbling was born out of a forced removal from the cycle. It is the accumulation of a repressed violence, forced to inaction. And only when the previously passive victims of the cycle of violence preferred to join it rather than give in to the ease despair would provide, could it be fully unleashed. This symbolic and thematical aspect doesn't offer an exhaustive vision or interpretation of the show's events and characters, of course, but it brings additional dimensions to characters each possessing their reasons, motivations, and ideas. It is possible to relate to, or at least to understand, each character, as well as where their reasoning comes from. This exceptional humanization is part of the series' greatest strengths. There is no absolute good, nor is there absolute evil. Everyone can become a god or a devil. All it takes is for people to believe in it. Our point of view as the audience puts us partly outside the plot, and therefore allows us, if we make the effort, to judge the characters' actions and motivations in a more objective way. But still, what if we were in place of Eren, Armin, Reiner, Zeke or Grisha? What guarantee do we have that we would be clairvoyant enough to keep our impartiality and our ability to think rationally under similar circumstances? Truth is, were we there instead of the show's characters, we would probably make the same mistakes, losing our temper after suffering a crushing loss. If vengeance, although subjugating us into its cycle of hatred, is in our best interest and helps fulfill our objective, or if we manage to escape the cycle of violence, but it comes back imposing itself onto our lives. Even in Attack on Titan, the cycle doesn't originate from a precise event or person. The Titan's appearance or King Fritz didn't create the concept of vengeance. The cycle of hatred also exists in our own world. It would be impossible to find someone who had never felt a desire for vengeance. It is indissociable from human nature. As long as humans hold firm to different beliefs, there will always be an enemy. But then, if the cycle of violence is integral to human nature, is it really possible to put it to an end? Though it was originally treated in an ambivalent way, Karl Fritz's solution is not the one supported by the show. Its results were only a fake and short-lived peace. The objective during the Uprising arc was to end the lies of the Rice family and of the government, based on the assumption that a cruel truth is better than a protective ignorance. We could think that Zeke's euthanasia plan is justified, as it is indeed based on an apparently concrete element. As long as Titans exist, history will only repeat itself, and so will hatred and vengeance. But the series treats this solution as that of the antagonists, and that is because it omits a number of truths. Sure, by eliminating every Eldian, Titans would disappear, but that would not be the case for the cycle of violence, or for violence itself. The show considers, and rightfully so, that genocide cannot be the solution to stop the cycle of violence. And that is why the rumbling, Eren's solution, is not the right one either. Even if he slaughters the rest of the world, violence will not stop. He would only gain a reduction of the scale. Instead of conflicts between countries, there would be conflicts between rival factions on Paradis. But if those who propose active solutions are all wrong, which answer is the right one? Which character knows the path we must follow? On several occasions, the show uses the forest metaphor to describe the violent nature of the world, and thus the cycle of violence. This metaphor represents the world as a dangerous forest, where we would all eventually give in, or die. Even before its explicit explanation, the forest metaphor can be found several times in the plot, notably illustrated by the forest of giant trees. Eren is indeed plunged into the forest during his first fight against Annie, and then again after discovering Reiner and Bertolt's true identities, two moments where he was consumed by his rage and by his desire for vengeance. Zeke is also at some point held prisoner within the forest, and ends up slaughtering everyone inside to escape it, similar to his use of violence to end suffering with his euthanasia plan. But most importantly, after the beginning of the rumbling, it is there that gathered those who were formerly enemies. But for the first time, they do not meet to fight each other, but to unite, and it is much harder to make peace when old wounds haven't yet been mended. Inside the forest, everyone speaks their mind, explains their point of view, and even apologizes in some cases. And only after the end of this confrontation can they all leave the forest for good. The path is not a dead end. It is possible to escape the cycle. First by realizing that our enemies aren't monsters but humans just like ourselves, then by refusing to give in to our desires for vengeance, acknowledging that the forest itself, the cycle of hatred, is responsible, to at last stop feeding it by stopping to act according to its will. This path is long and painful, but it is the only way to successfully get out of the forest. All may not have the strength or the courage to do so, whether voluntarily due to a fear of being confronted with the truth about our actions and thus about ourselves, or involuntarily due to a lack of mental strength or of conviction to oppose the cycle and the cruel nature of the world. A character of Attack on Titan understood all of this. A minor character both apparently and factually, and although his impact on the plot was very limited, it was colossal as per the theme of the cycle of violence. This character is Artur Braus, Sasha's father. Ever since his first appearance, it is obvious that he is aware of the world and its nature, and of the cycle of violence, being the first to establish the forest metaphor. Mr. Braus doesn't take part in the cycle itself, to the contrary he opposes it. He tries to stop it not through violence or physical strength, seeking to eliminate one side or forcing them not to use violence, but with words. Through listening and dialogue, he soothes the heated spirits, and calms the desires for vengeance responsible for the cycle's existence in the first place. The ancestral feuds must stay in the past where they belong. It is the adult's role to shoulder the sins of the past, to keep the children out of the forest. There is no miracle solution to the cycle of violence. There is no magical cure that will bring it to an end. As long as humans exist, so will the cycle. But all isn't lost. What Attack on Titan tells us about the cycle of violence is that even though it isn't possible to stop it on the scale of humanity, we can still act individually to free ourselves from it. It is still possible to bury the hatchet, to understand and to make peace with our enemies, and especially with our own mistakes and their consequences. For if we do not make peace with ourselves and do not accept who we are and what we have done, we cannot bring forth any change. And though it may seem futile or insignificant, even small steps can have a huge impact. We have only to get out of the forest. Thank you very much for watching this video till the end. As you can imagine, it took quite a long time to make it and required a lot of work. I invite you to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so, to be informed when new videos come out. This type of video is very new for me, so please tell me what you think about it in the comments. I do not claim to hold the definite truth. You are totally free to disagree with things I've said. Neither do I claim to have been exhaustive, or to have treated in their integrality the themes the series addresses. This isn't my goal in the first place. I only hope I made you think about the cycle of violence, and the way it is treated in Attack on Titan, and to have offered you new perspectives you maybe wouldn't have thought about. You can join my Discord server and follow me on Twitter and Instagram if you wish to do so. All links are in the description. That's it for me. I'll see you around.